Hello, and welcome to National Priorities Project's Data for Democracy webinar series. My name is Christopher Hellman, and today's webinar is the President's Fiscal Year 2013 Budget Request. In addition to this audio transcript, you can find a narrative and slides to accompany the NPP webinars on our website at nationalpriorities.org. So let's begin. The President's Fiscal 2013 Budget Request will serve as the basis for today's discussion, and we will look briefly at the federal budget process in general, the numbers in the fiscal year 2013 request with a focus on spending and revenues, the impact of the budget, particularly on states and localities, and the stories we think this budget is telling. First, why should you care about the 2013 budget request? Many Washington insiders expect that Congress won't enact a budget this year, or if they do, it won't look anything like the President's request. So why then are we concerned about what the administration is requesting for 2013? Well, first off, it does, in a political year, reflect the priorities of the Obama administration and the amalgamation of all the priorities of the various federal agencies that go into creating the federal budget request. In addition, it answers some very important questions about how the administration wants to deal with critical issues like the Budget Control Act of 2011, the upcoming potential spending cuts through the process known as sequestration, and the expiration of the Bush-era tax cuts, which are set to expire at the end of this year. In addition, it serves as the benchmark against which all subsequent fiscal year 2013 budget legislation will be measured. So we think that particularly in a political year such as this, it's an important document to understand as we move forward in the process. Moving to our first slide, there are 5 main steps to the federal budget process, beginning with the introduction of the President's budget request each year in February. There's actually a significant amount of work that goes into creating the federal budget before the President releases it in February, but we'll focus on the congressional portion of that because A, it's the most transparent, B, it's also where individuals or interested parties have the greatest ability to make an impact on the shape and form of the actual budget. So as I said, each February the President releases his budget request and submits it to Congress. Congress then carries out a series of steps to evaluate that request, starting with the creation in both the House and Senate of a budget resolution. The budget resolution sets overall spending guidelines for general categories of federal activities like security, agriculture, and education, but doesn't look at funding for particular programs. That portion of the process occurs later on. The next step, based on the budget resolutions enacted in the House and Senate, the members of the Appropriations Committee, each Appropriations Subcommittee, are given total numbers, funding levels to which they will be able to spend during the coming fiscal year. And using those numbers, they mark up their specific appropriations bills. This is the point in the process where individual programs like Head Start in education or food stamps in agriculture actually see what funding they will receive for the coming fiscal year. This occurs in both the House and the Senate, and each body then votes on their individual appropriations bills for each area of federal spending. Once both the House and Senate have voted on a particular set of appropriations, members of each body, the House and Senate, will then get together to iron out the differences between the two versions of their legislation. Once they have settled on a single bill that represents the views of both the House and the Senate, that is sent to the President for his signature. And when the President signs an appropriations bill, it becomes law. Once the President has signed all the appropriations bills passed by Congress, the budget has actually been enacted. So what does that mean as a practical level? This slide shows the 12 appropriation subcommittees which exist in both the House and the Senate. And using the labor Health and Human Services and Education Subcommittee as an example, in the lower left-hand corner, we'll see that the administration is requesting for Health and Human Services just over $920 billion for the coming fiscal year. It then falls to the members of the Labor, HHS, and Education Subcommittee to determine just how this money will be divided. Some examples of how these programs will be divided appear below. For instance, in education, Head Start is looking at about an $8 billion request. This is roughly 1% below where it was now, and it remains to be seen whether the House and Senate will agree to that number, raise it, or lower it. Likewise, the Low-Income Heating Assistance Program, otherwise known as LIHEAP, is projected to get $2.8 billion in fiscal year 2013. That's a 20% reduction from current levels. The third number you see in each of those blocks are state-level funding requests for each of these programs. So for instance, in Head Start, the state of Nevada is projected to get about $30 million, while in the LIHEAP program, Wisconsin is slated to get about $85 million. National Priorities Project, in addition to our other information, is able to offer a wide range of state-level data on programs of interest to people on our website. So if you're interested in looking at state-level data for programs like this, and for instance, the TANF program, also known as welfare, you can find these and state-level program funding at our website at nationalpriorities.org. So what are the highlights of the 2013 request? One of the things that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today is the deficit, and according to the administration, the 2013 request would reduce the annual deficit by roughly 32% from fiscal 2012 levels. It includes a substantial amount of money, $350 billion for job creation and worker training. And with regard to the Bush tax cuts, it allows the tax cuts for the wealthy, individuals making over $200,000 or families making over $250,000 a year to expire, while maintaining tax cuts for middle and working class. The Pentagon budget is slated to go down by roughly 2.6% from current levels, and we'll spend some more time talking about that later on, while non-defense areas of the discretionary budget will go down even further, being reduced by roughly 5% from current levels. Overall, total spending will decline by about 3.7% after it's adjusted for inflation. So let's look at the total federal budget for fiscal 2013. Total proposed spending is roughly $3.7 trillion, and this is broken into three areas. The smallest, at 7%, is interest on the national debt. Then the largest, representing almost 2/3 of all federal spending, is mandatory spending at 62%. And the remainder, and the portion of the budget on which we'll spend most of our time focusing today, is the discretionary budget, which represents about 1/3 of total federal spending. Let's go first to the mandatory budget. Mandatory programs are money that is spent in compliance with existing laws that govern specific programs or functions, mainly the major entitlement programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and the food stamp program, as well as Social Security and other retirement programs. Mandatory spending accounts, as I said, for roughly 2/3 of total federal spending. Changes in mandatory spending are relatively infrequent and often rather dramatic both in their size and scope. An example of recent changes in mandatory spending are the new regulations that Congress enacted 2 years ago to change federal health care policy that was, again, approved by Congress a couple years back. Looking now at the discretionary budget, as its name implies, discretionary spending is the portion of the budget that the President requests and Congress has to appropriate each year, and they do so at their discretion. It's this portion of the budget that receives the most attention and the one where we'll spend most of our focus today. It represents 1/3 of total annual spending, and it's about half of where our federal income tax dollars go. Discretionary part of the budget houses money for such things as international affairs, the military, and a lot of federal education and environmentally focused programs. And as you can see from this slide, more than half of the $1.2 trillion we'll spend on the discretionary budget in 2013, 57% of that goes to the military. The remaining areas, education, housing, international affairs, divide up the remainder, and as this slide shows, represent much smaller proportions of overall discretionary spending. So let's talk briefly about revenues. Far and away, the largest contributor to federal revenues each year are individual income taxes, the taxes that you and I pay through our payroll tax deduction, our income tax deductions, representing almost half of all annual revenue. We also contribute a substantial portion to federal revenues through our payroll taxes. Overall payroll taxes represent about 36% of annual revenues, and this portion of the revenues is divided roughly 50-50 between employers who contribute on our behalf and employees who contribute directly through their payroll tax deductions for such things as Medicare and Social Security. That line item on your paycheck that is called FICA, that represents our annual contribution to our payroll taxes. In a distant third, in the form of revenues, are corporate income taxes, which in 2013 would represent about 8% of total revenues. So as individuals, through our income taxes and our payroll deductions, you and I are responsible for almost two-thirds of overall revenues in a given year, while corporations pay a much smaller proportion of their income in the form of taxes. Missing from this portion, this slide, is the amount of money that we spend based on borrowing that occurs in a fiscal year. This year, our projected revenues are roughly $2.2 trillion. We will also end up borrowing another over an additional $1 trillion to make up the shortfall between projected expenditures and projected revenues. And it's this difference that represents what we commonly refer to as the deficit. So what's the impact of the federal budget? Listed here are a series of examples of federal programs funded through the federal government that provide services either directly or through state and local governments to individuals in our communities. Things like Head Start and Title I through our schools, housing assistance, and student loan and Pell Grants for colleges, college and university students. So these are just some of the many examples of how federal funds play out in your community. Looking specifically at this coming fiscal year, there are a number of programs that will see increases in funding. As we mentioned earlier, there's an emphasis on job creation through infrastructure investment in our highway program, federal work-study programs. We also see significant reductions in other areas of federal spending, some of them rather important assistance programs like the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, the Community Development Block Grant Program, and also the TANF program, more commonly referred to as welfare. These are just some examples of the winners and losers in the proposed fiscal 2013 budget. This is far from an exhaustive list, but gives you an example of some of the programs whose funding is either slated for increases or decreases based on the current proposal. Now we'll talk about the Budget Control Act of 2011. This is an important piece of legislation because it's really shaping the discussion over how we're going to move forward with the budget process in 2013. The Budget Control Act was enacted in August of 2011 as a result of an agreement between the administration and Congress in an effort to reduce the federal deficit by $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. it calls for a deficit reduction of $2.4 trillion over a 10-year period, $917 billion, which would be achieved immediately through savings by reducing spending in the discretionary budget, and then some additional cuts in future years. An additional $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years was intended to be realized through the work of a super committee that was created by the Budget Control Act that included members of both the House and Senate. What the Budget Control Act says and what actually happened is that if the committee enacts any amount, if the committee recommends and Congress enacts any amount less than that $1.2 trillion target in deficit reduction over 10 years, then something called sequestration would occur. Sequestration is a series of across-the-board spending cuts that would be utilized to make up the $1.2 trillion in necessary deficit reduction. As many people already know, the super committee was unable to come to any agreement, and Congress failed to enact any changes in federal spending towards that $1.2 trillion. So at this point in time, if things move ahead as law requires, sequestration will begin at the end of 2012, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. So what are the stories in this year's budget? As I indicated, one of the central themes in Washington this year is concern about the federal deficit. And what this chart here shows is federal deficits going back to World War II, where points below the horizontal line represent deficits, and points above the horizontal line represent annual surpluses. And what you see, with the exception of World War II at the far left, is that for about 20 years, 30 years, deficits and surpluses were annual occurrences. Some years we were operated in deficit, and other years we operated in surplus. It's not until the mid-1970s that you see the beginning of almost institutionalized annual deficits, which is the case of federal programs for about the next 20 years. We then see a brief return to surpluses around the year 2000 during the Clinton administration. And then in 2001, 2002, 2003, we see a return to deficits, primarily as a result of the enactment of the Bush-era tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, and the beginnings of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a slight, you'll notice, rallying where deficits are reduced around 2005, 2006 as a result of increasing economic performance. And then you see the impact of the economic collapse of 2007, where government deficits reach historically unprecedented levels, over $1 trillion annually, which is where we find ourselves now. So when you look at a table like this, it's easy to understand why deficits have become such an important portion of the debate over the annual budget in Washington. What's interesting to note, however, is that deficits over time tend to be more closely tied not so much to government spending as they are to government revenues. What this table here shows in the red bars is spending going up gradually over time. And while the trend is consistently upward, it's a rather gradual upward trend. Beneath that, however, you see fluctuations in annual deficits and surpluses shown in the form of the black columns, and these correspond more directly to fluctuations in revenues, which are the blue bars, than they do in changes in spending patterns. So what's really driving deficits in this country is not the level of federal spending as much as it is as the level of federal revenue. One of the second and also very important stories in this year's budget is the change in budget treatment of security spending within the discretionary budget. What we see here are two versions of discretionary pie. The one on the left looking very much like the one we looked at earlier, where defense represents more than half of discretionary spending, roughly 57%. But non-defense continues to represent a substantial portion of overall spending. We discussed earlier on slide 12, the Budget Control Act of 2011, that the BCA is having a significant impact on decisions made by the administration in preparing the 2013 budget. What the administration has also done is change the way we look at security, and to understand exactly how important this is, a little background information is helpful. In the past, as the pie chart on the left shows, discretionary spending has been divided into two large funding pots, non-defense and defense, where defense includes the Pentagon's annual budget, the cost of wars, and nuclear weapons-related work of the Department of Energy. Non-defense referred to everything else, as we saw earlier in the earlier slide, including things like education, transportation, housing, and veterans affairs and international assistance. In recent years, however, a new division of the discretionary budget has emerged, focusing on non-security and security, where security is a broader category of spending that includes not only what has traditionally been referred to as defense, but also such things as homeland security, veterans and international assistance, which have traditionally been part of the non-defense portion. Under the BCA, the Budget Control Act, the failure of the Super Committee and Congress to enact the $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction automatically triggers these across-the-board cuts referred to as sequestration. And under the current law, the cuts that would be required under sequestration would be divided evenly between defense and non-defense. However, what the administration is proposing in 2013 budget request is changing this requirement so that the cuts would be divided evenly between security and non-security. So what this proposal would mean is that while total discretionary spending would be cut by the same amount, as a result, security spending, while security spending goes down in 2013, it would be treated much less dramatically, and the cuts spread out more broadly than it would be under the original requirement that would focus the 50% of the cuts on defense. Meanwhile, this would have a disproportionate impact on the portion of the discretionary budget that remains in the non-security component, where it would still have to bear the brunt of 50% of the savings, but these savings would be drawn from a much smaller piece of the pie. So let's look at this question of sequestration. As we indicated, sequestration is the mechanism under the Budget Control Act where automatic spending cuts would occur if Congress fails to enact deficit reduction in the amount of $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. What's important to note is that while deficit reduction can include not only spending cuts, but also changes in revenues through the way we collect taxes or even tax increases, sequestration focuses on cuts only, and all the cuts would come from the discretionary budget. As we pointed out, discretionary spending proposed for 2013 would be about $1.2 trillion. Annual cuts under sequestration would equal roughly 10% reduction in overall discretionary spending in each of the next 10 years. And this would come on top of current budget projections, which also include rather dramatic proposed cuts. Finally, there's been a lot of talk recently about the fact that defense spending is going down. And if you look at the fiscal year 2013 budget, the truth of the matter is that defense spending is going down, but really only sort of. The $525 billion proposal for the Pentagon's annual base budget represents about a 2.6% reduction over current spending levels. Likewise, money for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are going down from current level $115 billion to a proposed $88.5 billion. Which is a reflection mainly of the end of combat operations in Iraq and the beginning of a drawdown in our forces in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, what the Pentagon is proposing are cuts of roughly $256 billion over 5 years and a total of $487 billion over 9 years. But just how real are these cuts? Before we get to that, it's important to note that even if the cuts were real, the military is very well positioned to absorb any reductions in its budget due to the substantial growth that's occurred in military spending over the last decades. If you look at this chart, the blue line represents military spending as compared to non-military spending in the discretionary budget, which is represented by the yellow line. We also separate out funding for international affairs, which is the green line, so that you're looking at a comparison of just military versus non-military in the discretionary budget. And what you see is that military spending, particularly over the last decade, has grown much more dramatically than discretionary spending. And if you eliminate from the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget the spike that occurs in 2008, 2009, which is the result of the temporary stimulus package that was enacted by Congress in 2008, you'll see that the difference between the military and non-military in the discretionary budget is rather significant. So even if cuts are coming for the military, the significant growth we've seen in annual military spending over the last decade leaves them better positioned to absorb any cuts than the non-defense portion of the discretionary budget. But just how real are these cuts? And to understand that, you need to look at a slightly different chart. If you look at the yellow line at the bottom, you'll see that spending between current levels in 2012 and projected levels in 2013 do go down. And as we point out, they're reduced by about 2.6%. But what you see after 2013, and it's important to point out that these lines have been adjusted for inflation, so we're talking about actual or real increases, that despite the rhetoric coming out of the Pentagon, military spending will actually increase, albeit very gradually, over the next 4 years. This is in marked contrast to what they're saying about the quote-unquote reductions that they are going to have to achieve. And the way they actually achieve these reductions are not by looking at spending where it currently is and where they project it, but they look at projections that they made last year. And these projections are represented with blue line. And last year at this time, when they were looking at spending, they were envisioning a much more favorable budgetary environment where spending would actually go up and by significant amounts and stay much higher than where it currently is. And the way they achieve the projected $256 billion in savings isn't by cutting money from where from where current funding levels are. It's by cutting proposed spending in future years based on what their projections were from last year. So it's by comparing the blue line to the yellow line that they achieve this quote-unquote spending cut of $256 billion over the next 5 years, when what we really see is that funding for the military will actually go up very gradually. Another way of looking at this is, let's say you go to work on a Friday and you're making about $50,000 a year, and your boss says to you, I'm going to start paying you $100,000 a year. And then you come into work on Monday and your boss comes to you and says, I'm sorry, I'm going to only be able to pay you $70,000. To you and I, that would be a pay increase. It would be a smaller pay increase than projected on Friday, but it's still a pay increase on Monday. But in Pentagon parlance, that's not a spending increase, that's a spending cut. So that concludes our prepared remarks for the President's Budget 2013 webinar. I hope you found this information informative, and as I said, you can find a transcript of this and links to additional resources on our website. In addition, National Priorities Project offers a broad range of resources through our website that will help you understand and explore the federal budget and how it works for you through things like our Build a Better Budget, NPP's database, our tax day charts, our Federal Budget 101 website, which gives you a detailed analysis of the federal budget process. You can also see and listen to our Federal Budget 101 webinar online. And we encourage you to check out our new book, A People's Guide to the Federal Budget, now available online through Amazon and through our website. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us today for President's Budget Fiscal Year 2013 Budget Request. If you have any questions on this or anything else related to the federal budget, please feel free to contact me. My contact information listed here. And I look forward to seeing you at future NPP webinars. Thank you, and have a good day.